Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious world of the fear and hysteria behind Salem. A story filled with whispers of power, betrayal, and secrets the old world tried to bury. There are moments in history that make you wonder how far humans could go for pride, for greed, or for survival, and this one is among them. So before you settle in, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room. And if you truly enjoy calm but dark storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through forgotten history. Now let's drift back in time together. The winter of 1692 had a particularly bitter bite in the small, isolated village of Salem. It was a place carved out of the vast, intimidating wilderness of the New World, a tiny pocket of English Puritanism clinging to the edge of a continent that felt both immense and hostile. The trees of the surrounding forest stood like silent, towering sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the perpetually gray sky, and the wind that swept in from the cold Atlantic seemed to carry with it a mournful, ceaseless whisper. Life here was a rigid affair, governed by hardship, strict religious doctrine, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. The devil, they believed, was not some distant, abstract concept. He was a real and present danger, lurking just beyond the firelight in the dark woods, and most terrifyingly within the hearts of their own neighbors. The world was a battlefield between God and Satan, and this small, struggling community felt they were on the very front lines. Every misfortune, from a failed crop to a sick cow or a child's fever, could be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure or, worse, as an act of satanic malice. This was the world into which the nightmare was born, not with a roar, but with a flicker of strangeness in the heart of the village parsonage. In the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris, a man known more for his rigid piety and contentious nature than for his warmth, the days were as colorless as the winter landscape. He had come to Salem village a few years prior, a merchant turned minister who struggled to command the respect and the salary he felt he deserved. His household was small, consisting of his wife, who was often ill, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, an orphan he had taken in. Also living with them was Tituba, an enslaved woman Paris had brought with him from Barbados. Her cultural background was a world away from the stark, unforgiving Puritanism of New England, and in the quiet moments of the long, dark evenings, she would sometimes share stories with the girls, tales of magic and folklore from her homeland, little sparks of imagination in a world that sought to extinguish them. It was in the bleakness of January, as the snow piled high against the windows and the fires burned low, that Betty Paris began to act strangely. She would dart under furniture, her eyes wide with a terror no one else could see. She complained of fever and would contort her body into unnatural positions, her small frame writhing as if in the grip of some invisible force. Soon after, Abigail Williams began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. The girls would scream out in pain, their voices raw and filled with agony, claiming they were being pinched, bitten, and pricked with pins by unseen assailants. The village was small, and news, especially of such a disturbing nature, traveled fast. Neighbors gathered in hushed, worried circles, their faces etched with concern and a growing dread. Reverend Parris, a man already wrestling with his own insecurities and his congregation's disputes, was thrown into a state of panic. He prayed, he fasted, but the girl's afflictions only worsened. He called for the local physician, William Griggs, a man of limited medical knowledge in an era when medicine itself was a murky blend of science and superstition. Dr. Griggs examined the girls, observing their frantic, uncontrollable fits, their vacant stares, and their guttural, choking sounds. He could find no physical ailment, no logical explanation for their torment. After exhausting all the natural possibilities he could imagine, he uttered the words that would ignite the kindling of Salem's fear into a raging inferno. The children, he concluded, were bewitched. The source of their suffering was not a disease of the body, but an assault on the soul. They were under the evil hand. The diagnosis fell like a death sentence upon the quiet atmosphere of the parsonage, confirming the community's deepest, darkest anxieties. The devil was not just in the woods. He was here in Salem Village, and he had found a way into the minister's own home. The question that immediately consumed the minds of everyone in the village was a simple yet terrifying one. Who? Who was doing this? Who had made a pact with the devil to torment these innocent children? The pressure mounted, particularly on the afflicted girls themselves. Day after day, they were prodded and questioned by ministers and concerned neighbors who gathered in the small, stuffy rooms of the parsonage. "Who is it that afflicts you?" they would ask, their voices a mixture of pity and a desperate need for answers. For a time, Betty and Abigail refused to name anyone, perhaps too young or too frightened to point a finger. But the questioning was relentless, and another afflicted girl, Ann Putnam Jr., a troubled and impressionable 12-year-old from a powerful and vindictive village family, soon joined their ranks. Under the intense scrutiny and the leading questions of the adults, the girls finally began to whisper names. The first to be accused were three women who, for different reasons, existed on the fringes of Puritan society, making them easy and vulnerable targets. There was Sarah Good, a destitute, pipe-smoking beggar who often muttered to herself as she wandered the village, making people uncomfortable. Then there was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had been involved in disputes over her late husband's estate and had not attended church in over a year, a significant social transgression. And finally, there was Tituba, Reverend Parris's own enslaved servant, a woman of a different race and a different culture, an outsider in every sense of the word. The three accused women were arrested and brought before the local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, for a preliminary examination held in the village meeting house. The meeting house was packed to the rafters, the entire community turning out to witness the confrontation between good and evil. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne vehemently denied the charges, their pleas of innocence falling on deaf ears. The afflicted girls, present in the room, put on a horrifyingly convincing performance. Whenever one of the accused women would speak or even shift her gaze, the girls would scream and contort, claiming they were being tormented by the woman's specter. But it was Tituba's testimony that would change everything. For 2 days, she too denied any involvement. However, it is believed that Reverend Parris, her master, beat her until she agreed to confess. Alone, terrified, and likely realizing that a confession might be her only path to survival, Tituba finally broke. But she didn't just confess. She wove a fantastical and terrifying tale, a story that gave shape and substance to the villagers' worst fears. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of a tall man from Boston dressed in black who bid her to serve him. She described flying through the air on a pole and attending a witch's sabbath. She even implicated Good and Osborne, claiming she had seen their spectral forms alongside her. But most chillingly, she spoke of others, of a coven of witches in Salem village, their names not yet known to her, who were plotting the destruction of the Puritan community. Her confession was a sensation. It was everything the magistrates and the ministers wanted to hear, a detailed, first-hand account of the devil's work in their midst. It transformed the proceedings from a local curiosity into a full-blown witch hunt. Tituba's vivid, coerced narrative provided the blueprint for the trials to come. It validated the girl's accusations, confirmed the presence of a satanic conspiracy, and created an urgent, terrifying need to root out the other witches before it was too late. The hysteria had now been given a voice, and it was about to spread like wildfire. The afflicted girls, once powerless and on the lowest rung of the social ladder, found themselves suddenly elevated to a position of immense authority. They were seen as seers, as victims touched by the supernatural, their words holding the power of life and death. The circle of accusers widened, and more girls and young women began to show the same symptoms, their fits becoming more dramatic and theatrical with each new examination. They became local celebrities, the center of a terrifying and gripping drama that had consumed the entire community. Their accusations began to move beyond the usual suspects of outcasts and deviants. Respected, church-going members of the community were now being named. One of the most shocking accusations was leveled against Rebecca Nurse, a frail, 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety and gentle nature. The charge seemed so preposterous that many in the community were stunned into disbelief. Dozens of her neighbors signed a petition attesting to her good character, but it was to no avail. In the courtroom, the moment she entered, the afflicted girls fell into violent convulsions. Their spectral visions, their unseen torments, were now considered irrefutable evidence. When asked for her opinion of the fits, Rebecca Nurse, a woman of unwavering faith, replied softly, "I have got nobody to look to but God." Her quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the chaos erupting around her, but in the fevered atmosphere of the trials, it was not enough to save her. The legal proceedings were a terrifying perversion of justice. The magistrates, particularly the unyielding John Hathorne, operated on a presumption of guilt. The accused were not allowed legal counsel and were forced to defend themselves against charges that were, by their very nature, impossible to disprove. The primary evidence used against them was spectral evidence, the testimony of the accusers that the specter, or spirit, of the accused person was tormenting them. How could one prove that their spirit had not left their body to inflict harm, while they themselves sat in prison? It was a legal and logical trap from which there was no escape. If you denied the charges, you were seen as brazenly lying in the face of the girl's visible suffering, and likely in league with the devil, who was the father of lies. This path almost certainly led to the gallows. The alternative was to confess. A confession, however, came with its own terrible price. While it might spare you from immediate execution, as the Puritans believed God would judge the confessed sinner, it required you to validate the court's proceedings and, crucially, to name other witches. This created a horrifying cycle of accusations, where people, in a desperate bid to save their own lives, were coerced into condemning their friends and neighbors. The prisons in Salem and nearby towns began to swell with the accused, filled with men, women, and even children, all living in dark, squalid conditions while they awaited their fate. As the spring of 1692 turned into a sweltering summer, the hysteria reached its peak. A special court of oyer and terminer, meaning to hear and to determine, was established to handle the backlog of witchcraft cases. On June 2nd, the court handed down its first conviction. Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper with a reputation for being flamboyant and outspoken, was found guilty of witchcraft. She had been accused years earlier but was acquitted. This time, her reputation and the relentless testimony of the afflicted girls sealed her fate. On June 10th, she was taken to Gallows Hill, a barren ridge overlooking the village, and became the first person to be hanged in the Salem witch trials. Her death did not quell the fear, it only seemed to intensify it. The trials continued with a grim, methodical certainty. In the months that followed, more and more people were condemned. 5 were hanged in July, another 5 in August, and 8 more in September. One man, an elderly farmer named Giles Corey, who refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty, was subjected to a brutal and archaic form of torture called peine forte et dure. Heavy stones were piled upon his chest in an attempt to force a plea from him. For 2 days, he endured the agony, his only response to the court's demands being a defiant cry for more weight. He died under the crushing load, a martyr to his own stubborn will, believing that by refusing to plead, he would prevent his property from being confiscated and thus preserve it for his children. His death was a particularly gruesome and shocking event in a summer already filled with horror. The world of Salem Village had turned upside down. The social order had been completely subverted. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, old grudges and petty disputes bubbling to the surface in the form of deadly accusations. A simple disagreement over property lines or a perceived social slight could now have fatal consequences. The afflicted girls roamed the courtrooms as the ultimate arbiters of truth, their every shriek and spasm treated as gospel. People lived in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety, wondering if a careless word or a strange dream could lead to their own arrest. The very fabric of the community was unraveling, torn apart by fear, paranoia, and a legal system that had abandoned reason in favor of superstition. But as the leaves began to turn and the death toll mounted, the first whispers of doubt began to challenge the roar of the hysteria. The accusers, emboldened by their unchecked power, grew reckless. They began to name individuals who were not only respected but also wealthy and powerful, including the wife of the governor of Massachusetts himself, Sir William Phips. This was a critical turning point. When the accusations were confined to social outcasts and contentious farmers, the ruling elite were willing to let the trials proceed. But when the fire began to lick at the edges of their own circles, they started to question the validity of the evidence being used. Prominent and influential ministers in Boston, like Increase Mather, who had initially been cautious but not entirely dismissive of the trials, began to openly criticize the court's reliance on spectral evidence. In a powerful sermon, Mather famously declared that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be put to death. His words carried immense weight and signaled a shift in the intellectual and theological climate. Governor Phips, perhaps spurred on by the accusation against his own wife, finally intervened. In October of 1692, he ordered a halt to the proceedings of the court of Oyer and Terminer and forbade any further arrests. He established a new superior court of judicature to handle the remaining cases, and crucially, he instructed this new court to disallow the use of spectral evidence. Without the visions of the afflicted girls to condemn them, the entire basis of the prosecution's case crumbled. Of the dozens of cases heard by the new court, the vast majority were acquitted. By May of 1693, Governor Phipps had issued pardons for all those who remained in prison on witchcraft charges. The Great Salem witch hunt was finally over. The fever had broken, but the damage was profound and irreparable. In the quiet aftermath, the community of Salem was left to grapple with the enormity of what they had done. 19 people had been hanged, Giles Corey had been pressed to death, and several more had died in the wretched conditions of the prisons. Families were shattered, reputations destroyed, and the landscape was littered with the graves of the innocent. A deep and abiding sense of guilt began to settle over the town. The afflicted girls, once the revered and feared center of attention, quietly faded back into obscurity, their afflictions mysteriously vanishing as soon as the trials ended. In the years that followed, there were public apologies and days of fasting and repentance. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges from the court of Oyer and Terminer, stood before his congregation as a statement of his own guilt and remorse was read aloud, asking for forgiveness from both God and man. Ann Putnam, Jr., one of the most prolific of the accusers, would later offer a public apology as well, claiming she had been deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people. The government of Massachusetts officially cleared the names of the victims and even offered some financial restitution to their families, a tacit admission of the grave injustice that had been committed. The story of the Salem witch trials serves as a chilling and enduring lesson, a stark reminder of how a community can be consumed by its own fears. It wasn't just a belief in witchcraft that caused the tragedy. It was a perfect storm of contributing factors. There were the anxieties of life in a harsh and unforgiving environment, the ongoing threat of war with Native American tribes, a recent smallpox epidemic, and deep-seated social and economic divisions within Salem Village itself. The rigid Puritan worldview, which saw the world as a constant struggle against a very real devil, provided the theological framework for the hysteria. When the young girls began their strange fits, these simmering tensions and latent fears exploded to the surface. The accusations became a way to explain the unexplainable, to scapegoat the marginalized, and, for some, to settle old scores. It was a tragic testament to the dangers of religious extremism, the failure of critical thinking, and the terrifying power of mass hysteria. It shows us how quickly the lines between neighbor and enemy, justice and vengeance, can blur when reason is abandoned in the face of overwhelming fear. The whispers that began in the Paris parsonage became a roar that tore a community apart, leaving behind a legacy of shame and a cautionary tale that echoes through the centuries, reminding us of the darkness that can lie not in some supernatural evil, but within the human heart itself, waiting for the right conditions to be unleashed upon the world. The events of 1692 were not just a bizarre footnote in history. They were a profound human tragedy driven by a collective loss of reason and compassion, a sober warning of what can happen when fear is allowed to become the ultimate authority. The tale of Salem did not simply end with the final pardon and the quiet closing of the prison doors. The silence that fell over the village was not one of peace, but of a heavy, shared shame. The field still needed to be plowed, the cattle tended to, and the harsh realities of colonial life faced, but now there was a hollowness in the daily routines. People who had once shared bread and prayed together in the meeting house now passed each other on the muddy lanes with averted eyes. How could you look your neighbor in the eye when you had stood by and watched his wife be carted off to the gallows, based on the spectral visions of a young girl. How could you sleep at night knowing your testimony, perhaps given in a moment of panic to save your own skin, had sent an innocent person to their death? The community was not just broken, it was haunted. The gallows on the hill stood as a stark, skeletal monument to their collective madness, and the ghosts of the dead seemed to linger in the cold New England air. The families of the victims bore the deepest scars. They had not only lost their loved ones, but had also endured the confiscation of their property and the blackening of their family names. For them, the official apologies and meager financial compensations offered little solace. The stain of witchcraft was not easily washed away, and the grief they carried was a burden they would bear for the rest of their days. The key figures in the drama met with varied fates. Reverend Samuel Parris, the man in whose house the nightmare began, never recovered his standing in the community. His parishioners, filled with resentment over his central role in the trials and his unyielding pursuit of the accused, eventually drove him from the village. He wandered from town to town, taking on minor posts, a man forever defined by the hysteria he helped to unleash. He died in relative obscurity, a bitter and broken figure. The magistrates, like John Hathorne, largely escaped official censure, melting back into the colonial establishment. Hathorne himself never publicly expressed remorse for his actions, and his descendants would carry the weight of his legacy for generations. One of his great-grandsons, the famed author Nathaniel Hawthorne, would even add a W to his surname in an attempt to distance himself from the infamous hanging judge of Salem. The afflicted girls, the young engines of the tragedy, met with far quieter fates. After their brief, terrifying stint in the spotlight, they were reabsorbed into the fabric of society. Some married and moved away, their pasts either unknown or unspoken of in their new communities. Ann Putnam, Jr., as mentioned, was the only one to offer a formal apology, a gesture that spoke to a conscience deeply troubled by the role she had played. The others remained silent, taking the secrets of what truly happened in those fevered months, the mixture of genuine delusion, childish pranks, and malicious intent, with them to their graves. And what of Tituba, the enslaved woman whose coerced confession had provided the very script for the witch hunt? After her confession, she was returned to jail, her life spared but her freedom still denied. She languished in the Boston prison for over a year because Reverend Parris refused to pay the fees for her release. She had served her purpose in the drama, and now she was a disposable character. Eventually, she was sold to a new, unknown master for the price of her jail fees, and she vanished completely from the historical record. Her fate remains a mystery, a poignant symbol of how the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals in the story were ultimately the most forgotten. Her voice, so powerful and terrifying in the early days of the trials, was silenced, and her story became a footnote in the larger tragedy she had been forced to help create. Her experience underscores the complex interplay of race, class, and gender that ran as a dark undercurrent through the entire affair. She was the perfect scapegoat, a non-white, non-Puritan woman in a society that was deeply suspicious of anyone who was different. Her confession, a product of violence and desperation, was eagerly accepted because it confirmed what the Puritan elders already believed about the inherent sinfulness of those they considered other. In the decades and centuries that followed, the Salem witch trials became a powerful and enduring symbol in American culture. They were invoked as a cautionary tale against religious extremism and the dangers of a justice system untethered from reason. The phrase witch hunt entered the popular lexicon as a term for any campaign of persecution based on flimsy evidence and mass hysteria. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, used the events of 1692 as a powerful allegory for the anti-communist paranoia of the McCarthy era, demonstrating how the themes of fear, accusation, and the pressure to conform are timeless and universal. The story of Salem forces us to confront uncomfortable truth about human nature. It reveals our capacity for cruelty, our tendency to seek simple answers to complex problems, and our willingness to believe the unbelievable when we are afraid. It shows how good, ordinary people can be swept up in a collective delusion and participate in acts of extraordinary injustice. The people of Salem were not uniquely evil. They were human, and their story is a chilling reminder of the fragility of civilization and the thin veneer of reason that separates order from chaos. Looking back, historians and sociologists have identified a host of contributing factors that created the fertile ground for the hysteria. Beyond the religious fanaticism and social tensions, there were economic anxieties. Salem Village, a poor farming community, was in a constant state of friction with the more prosperous, merchant-driven Salem town. Many of the accusers came from the struggling village, while a significant number of the accused were connected to the wealthier town, suggesting that envy and resentment played a significant role in who was targeted. There have also been medical theories, such as the possibility of ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye, a staple grain for the colonists, and can cause symptoms like muscle spasms, vomiting, and hallucinations, symptoms remarkably similar to those described by the afflicted girls. While this theory is compelling, it cannot fully explain the calculated and targeted nature of the accusations, or why the fits conveniently stopped when the trials ended. The truth is likely a complex tapestry woven from many threads, a genuine belief in the supernatural, pre-existing community conflicts, the psychological pressures on a group of adolescent girls, and a legal system that was woefully inadequate to the task before it. No single explanation suffices. The tragedy of Salem was born from a convergence of unfortunate circumstances, a perfect storm of fear and folly. The final lesson of Salem, perhaps, is one of humility. It is a reminder of the importance of due process, of the need to protect the rights of the accused, and of the profound danger of allowing fear and superstition to dictate public policy. It teaches us to be skeptical of those who claim to have all the answers, especially when those answers involve identifying and persecuting a scapegoat. The story cautions us to look for the humanity in those who are different from us, to resist the urge to demonize the outsider, and to question our own certainties, especially when those certainties are being fueled by panic and paranoia. The 19 bodies that were unceremoniously cut from the gallows and buried in shallow, unmarked graves on Gallows Hill are a testament to the fatal consequences of a society that loses its way. They were not witches. They were farmers, mothers, grandmothers, and tavern keepers. They were people who, by a cruel twist of fate, became the victims of their neighbors' deepest anxieties. Their story is not just a piece of dark history or a spooky tale to be told on Halloween. It is a timeless and vital warning, a chapter in the human story that we must never be allowed to forget, lest we find ourselves, in our own time, standing on the edge of a similar abyss, pointing fingers in the dark and mistaking our own fear for the face of evil. The wind that still blows over the quiet hills of Danvers, the modern-day site of the old Salem village, seems to carry with it the faint echoes of their names, a soft but persistent reminder of the price of hysteria and the enduring need for reason, tolerance, and justice. The legacy of Salem also forced a slow, painful evolution in the American legal system. The blatant injustices of the trials, particularly the use of spectral evidence and the coercion of confessions, highlighted the critical need for a more rational and evidence-based approach to justice. In the aftermath, there was a growing recognition that the legal system had to be a shield for the innocent, not merely a sword for the powerful. The principles that would later be enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, the presumption of innocence, the right to legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the separation of church and state, can be seen as a direct response to the kind of legal and theological tyranny that ran rampant in 1692. The ghosts of Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, hanged on the word of hysterical girls, stand as silent witnesses behind the very architecture of modern American law. Their tragedy helped to lay the groundwork for a system that, while imperfect, strives to ensure that accusations must be backed by tangible proof, and that belief alone is never enough to condemn a person. It was a lesson paid for in blood, a foundational moment of reckoning that helped shape the nation's long and arduous journey toward a more just and equitable society. The names of the dead are now inscribed on a somber memorial in Salem, a place of quiet reflection where visitors can ponder the terrible cost of fear. It stands as a permanent acknowledgement of their innocence and a pledge that such a tragedy should never be repeated. The story, in its finality, is a testament to both the darkest depths and the potential for redemption within the human spirit. It shows how a community can descend into madness, but also how, in the aftermath, it can slowly, painfully, find its way back to the light, forever changed and bearing the scars of its own terrible history. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious world of the role of religion and Puritan beliefs, a story filled with whispers of power, betrayal, and secrets the old world tried to bury. There are moments in history that make you wonder how far humans could go for pride, for greed, or for survival, and this one is among them. So before you settle in, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room, and if you truly enjoy calm but dark storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through forgotten history. Now let's drift back in time together. The kingdom of Ethelgard was a land painted in shades of gray, not just by the often overcast sky that hung low like a damp woolen blanket, but by the very will of its people and its king. King Alaric ruled with a piety so sharp it could cut glass, his every decree etched with the severe doctrines of the Assembly of Elders. Life in Ethelgard was a straight and narrow path, and to deviate even a single step was to invite scrutiny, whispers, and the cold judgment of your neighbors. The world, according to the elders, was a battlefield between the divine and the diabolical, and every soul was a soldier, whether they knew it or not. There were no songs, for joy was a distraction from devotion. There was no bright color in their clothing, for vanity was a sin that invited the devil's gaze. Life was a solemn march of prayer, work, and vigilance, a constant watch for the subtle tendrils of evil that might creep into the hearts of men. In the small village of Oakhaven, nestled in the shadow of the king's formidable stone castle, lived a young woman named Elspeth. She lived with her mother, Morwen, a weaver of some renown, and her father, Bram, a farmer whose hands were as cracked and worn as the soil he tilled. Their lives were like everyone else's, a predictable rhythm of sunrise labor and sunset prayer. Yet there was a quiet spark in Elspeth, a curiosity that the monotonous gray world could not extinguish. She saw beauty in the deep green of moss on an old stone wall, in the fleeting purple of a twilight sky, and in the intricate patterns her mother wove into otherwise plain fabrics. Morwen's craft was a small rebellion, a whisper of artistry in a world that demanded uniformity. She used dyes made from roots and berries, creating subtle hues of russet, heather, and moss that were just vibrant enough to be beautiful, but muted enough to avoid the wrath of the village deacon. The kingdom was governed by a set of laws known as the Iron Covenants, rules so rigid they left no room for human error or emotion. To miss the Sunday sermon was to spend a day in the public stocks, a target for rotten vegetables and the scorn of the righteous. To be heard laughing too loudly was to earn a stern lecture on the frivolity of the flesh. A woman who spoke out of turn or challenged a man's word was deemed impertinent, a vessel for a disobedient spirit. The most peculiar and feared of these laws was the one concerning unnatural affinities. This vague decree forbade any trafficking with old folkways, the herbal remedies of the past, or any knowledge not sanctioned by the assembly of elders. It was a law that hung in the air, a net ready to ensnare anyone who seemed just a little too different, a little too knowledgeable in the ways of the earth rather than the ways of the Scripture. The year the blight came, a profound and unshakable fear began to settle over Ethelgard. It started in the eastern fields, a creeping blackness that withered the wheat stalks and turned the barley to dust. Bram's fields were not spared, and he would return from his work each evening with a deeper line of worry etched into his brow. King Alaric declared a week of fasting and prayer, convinced that the kingdom's piety was being tested. He stood before his people, his face a mask of grim certainty, and spoke of a spiritual corruption that had taken root in the land, a corruption that manifested as a physical blight upon their harvest. He was a tall man, severe and unyielding, his belief in his own righteousness as solid as the stone walls of his castle. His queen, Alara, stood beside him, her face serene and passive, a perfect portrait of devout obedience. But behind her eyes, a flicker of unease had already begun to stir. The prayers did not work. The fasts left the people weak and hungry, but the blight continued its relentless march. Then a second shadow fell. Lord Valerius, a nobleman close to the king, saw his youngest son fall gravely ill with a fever that no physician could explain. The boy shivered and cried out in the night, speaking of dark shapes that danced in the corners of his room. This was all the proof the king's chief advisor, the formidable inquisitor Thuron, needed. Thuron was a man carved from judgment, his eyes holding a zealot's fire. He saw the devil's hand in every misfortune, every shadow, every moment of human weakness. He rose before the assembly of elders, his voice thundering through the great hall, and declared that the blight and the sickness were not a test, but an attack. Ethelgard, he proclaimed, harbored a nest of witches, servants of Satan who had made a pact to bring ruin upon God's chosen kingdom. The hunt began. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper, a finger pointed at the most vulnerable. Old widow Hestia, who lived alone at the edge of the woods, was the first to be taken. She was a woman the village had long kept at a distance, her solitude and her knowledge of wild herbs making her an easy target. She had provided poultices for colicky bobbies and teas for troubled sleep for as long as anyone could remember. But now this knowledge was reframed as sinister. Inquisitor Thuron's men dragged her from her small cottage, presenting her worldly possessions as evidence of her guilt. The dried bundles of chamomile and lavender were called instruments of spellcraft. Her black cat, a stray she had taken in, was declared a familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form. Her trial was a spectacle of fear and absurdity. Hestia, confused and terrified, could not answer the Inquisitor's twisting questions. When she denied making a pact with the devil, Thuron accused her of lying. When she remained silent, he claimed her silence was a confession of guilt. The concept of spectral evidence was introduced, a terrifyingly effective tool. Young girls from the village, including the daughter of the deacon, were brought forward to testify. They claimed that Hestia's spirit, her spectral form, had visited them in the night, pinching them, tormenting them, and trying to force them to sign the devil's book. It was a performance of hysteria, the girls shrieking and contorting on the witness stand, their accusations impossible to disprove. How could one defend against a crime committed by their own ghost? Hestia was found guilty, her protestations lost in the roar of the righteous crowd. She was sentenced to hang, a grim warning to any others who might stray from the path. Elspeth watched the procession from a distance, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She had known the old woman, had occasionally brought her bread and cheese. She remembered her as a lonely soul with kind, crinkled eyes, not a monster. But to voice such a thought aloud would be to invite the same suspicion upon herself. The execution of Widow Hestia did not end the kingdom's troubles. The blight spread to the northern farms, and 2 more children in the village fell ill with the same mysterious fever. The fear intensified, curdling into a full-blown panic. Inquisitor Thuron, his influence over the king growing with each passing day, announced that a coven was at work, a conspiracy of darkness hidden in plain sight. He established a special court, with himself as the chief arbiter, to root out the evil. An atmosphere of profound suspicion descended upon Oakhaven. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust, their conversations becoming hushed and guarded. A misspoken word, a strange dream shared in confidence, an old grudge, any of these could become the seed of a deadly accusation. The strict societal rules that had once bound them together now became the very tools used to tear them apart. Elspeth felt the change in the air, the way people's gazes would linger on her mother's loom, on the subtle colors of her threads. Morwen, sensing the danger, began to weave only with plain, undyed wool, her small act of rebellion extinguished by fear. One afternoon, Elspeth's childhood friend, a boy named Finn, was named. His crime was that he had been seen near the woods after dusk, a place the elders had recently declared unholy ground. His accuser was a farmer who had a long-standing dispute with Finn's father over a piece of land. In the courtroom, Finn's youthful energy was twisted into evidence of a wild, untamable spirit. His love for exploring the woods was painted as a communion with dark forces. Under Thuron's relentless questioning, the terrified boy eventually broke down and confessed to anything that was asked of him, implicating others in his desperate, nonsensical story. He was taken away, his fate sealed, and another family in Oakhaven was destroyed. King Alaric saw these trials as a sign of his kingdom's moral purification. He believed he was a divine instrument, cleansing his land of a hidden pestilence. He spent hours in prayer, his conviction bolstered by Inquisitor Thuron, who fed him constant reports of the court's progress. The king was so insulated by his certainty, so surrounded by men who echoed his own beliefs, that he never saw the true cost of his crusade. He never saw the untended fields of the accused, the children left orphaned, or the quiet, pervasive terror that had replaced the solemn piety he so cherished. Queen Alara, however, was beginning to see. From her guarded position within the court, she witnessed the petty jealousies and personal vendettas that fueled the accusations. She saw how Thuron's power swelled, how he used the confessions to confiscate land and property, enriching the coffers of the assembly and his own loyal followers. She tried to speak to her husband, to gently suggest that perhaps some of the accused were innocent, but he dismissed her concerns as a woman's weakness, a lack of spiritual fortitude. The crisis reached Elspeth's own doorstep on a cold, rain-swept evening. The knock on the door was heavy, official. Outside stood the deacon and two of the Inquisitor's guards. They had come for her mother, Morwen. The accusation had been made by the deacon's own wife, a woman who had long been jealous of Morwen's weaving skills. The evidence presented was a collection of twisted half-truths. A neighbor testified that Morwen's small garden seemed strangely immune to the blight that affected everyone else's, a sign of unnatural intervention. It was true that Morwen's garden was healthier, but it was due to her meticulous care, her knowledge of crop rotation passed down from her grandmother, not witchcraft. The deacon's wife claimed the subtle colors in Morwen's past weavings were a form of vanity, a lure for the devil. The most damning proof was a small, hand-carved bird Elspeth's father had made for her mother years ago. The guards presented it as a poppet, an idol used for dark magic. Bram protested, his voice thick with outrage and disbelief, but he was shoved aside. Elspeth watched in horror as they bound her mother's hands. The woman who had only ever shown kindness and quiet strength, now being treated like a dangerous criminal. Morwen was taken to the dungeons beneath the castle, a place of damp stone and despair. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice. Inquisitor Thuron presided, his face an unreadable mask of piety. Morwen, pale but resolute, denied every charge. She explained that her knowledge of plants was simple folk wisdom, not sorcery. She insisted the carved bird was a mere token of love. But in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, her calm denials were interpreted as the cunning of a practiced witch. Thuron ordered her to be put to the question, a euphemism for torture. They believed that pain would break the devil's hold and force a confession, the only path to saving the sinner's soul, even if it meant destroying their body. Days turned into a week. Elspeth and her father were forbidden from seeing Morwen. They were now pariahs in the village, the family of an accused witch. Old friends crossed the street to avoid them, their faces averted. Desperate, Bram tried to appeal to Lord Valerius, whose son had been the first to fall ill, but the nobleman, terrified of being associated with a potential heretic, refused to see him. Elspeth felt a profound and terrifying helplessness, a sense that the world she knew was built on a foundation of lies and fear, and it was now crumbling around her. She could not sleep, haunted by images of her mother alone in the dark, suffering unimaginable cruelty. The kingdom's obsession with rooting out a fantastical evil was creating a very real one, an evil of injustice, cruelty, and the abuse of absolute power. Inside the castle, Queen Alara's disquiet had grown into full-blown alarm. The accusations were creeping closer to the throne. A distant cousin of hers, a lady of the court known for her sharp wit and independent mind, was suddenly named by one of the confessing witches. The charge was preposterous, yet Inquisitor Thuron pursued it with the same grim determination he had shown with the peasants. The king, his judgment clouded by Thuron's influence, allowed the investigation to proceed. For Ilara, this was the final straw. She realized that no one was safe, that the fire, once lit, would consume everything in its path, including the very structures of power that had unleashed it. The system was not cleansing the kingdom, it was devouring it. The fields lay barren not because of a witch's curse, but because the farmers who were supposed to be tending them were either in prison or too afraid to leave their homes. The economy was grinding to a halt, and the kingdom was starving, not from a blight, but from a plague of fear. Ilara decided to act. She knew that confronting the king directly was futile. She needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would shatter the foundation of Thuron's holy war. Moving with the utmost secrecy, she began her own investigation. She summoned a loyal guard, a man whose own sister had been one of the first accused and who harbored a deep, quiet resentment for the Inquisitor. She also sought out a junior member of the Assembly of Elders, a thoughtful young man named Elias, who she had observed watching the trials with troubled eyes. Together, this small, clandestine group began to unravel the web of lies that Thuron had spun. The guard, using his access, discovered that the confiscated lands of the accused were being quietly transferred to a holding company controlled by Thuron's closest allies. This was not about piety, it was about greed and power. Meanwhile, Elias, searching through old records in the castle library, made a startling discovery. He found geological surveys and agricultural reports from the reign of Alaric's father. The reports detailed a recurring blight in the eastern fields, a natural fungus that appeared every few decades when the rains were unusually heavy. It had nothing to do with magic. At the same time, Ilara, speaking with the royal physician under the guise of discussing her own health, learned that the symptoms of the sick children, the fevers, the hallucinations, were consistent with ergot poisoning, a fungus that could grow on damp rye, the very grain the villagers were now consuming due to the wheat shortage. She even found evidence that Thuron's own men had been instructed to guard the village's clean well, forcing the common folk to use an older, more stagnant source downstream. Thuron had not been fighting a curse. He had been exploiting a series of natural misfortunes, masterfully fanning the flames of superstition to achieve his own ends. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Elias managed to speak with one of the young girls who had been a key accuser. Away from the pressure of the courtroom and Thuron's intimidating presence, the girl broke down, confessing that the Inquisitor had coached them. He had described what they should say, how they should act, promising them and their families safety and favor in exchange for their testimony. They were not possessed or tormented by spirits. They were terrified children being used as pawns in a deadly game. The spectral evidence, the very cornerstone of the trials, was a complete fabrication. Ilara now had everything she needed. The knowledge of the injustice, the manufactured hysteria, and the calculated cruelty of Inquisitor Thuron settled in her heart like a block of ice. She knew the final confrontation would be perilous. Thuron's power was nearly absolute, and the king was a man who did not take kindly to being proven wrong. She chose her moment carefully. She waited for the next public assembly, a gathering where King Alaric was to announce a new set of even stricter covenants to further purify the kingdom. The great hall was packed with nobles, elders and deacons, with Thuron standing proudly at the king's right hand. Just as the inquisitor stepped forward to speak, Queen Alara entered, not as a silent consort, but as a figure of authority. She was flanked by her loyal guard and Elias, who carried a stack of scrolls and ledgers. She addressed the assembly directly, her voice clear and steady, a stark contrast to the thundering rhetoric they were used to. She began by presenting the old agricultural reports, showing that the blight was a known, natural phenomenon. She then had the royal physician explain the effects of ergot poisoning, matching the symptoms of the afflicted children perfectly. A murmur of confusion rippled through the hall. Thuron, his face turning pale with fury, tried to decry her as a hysterical woman, a heretic speaking blasphemy. But Alara was prepared. She unrolled the ledgers showing the land transfers, the clear pattern of greed and corruption. Finally, she brought forward the young girl, who, with trembling voice, told the entire assembly how Thuron had manipulated her and the other children, forcing them to lie, to send innocent people to their deaths. The confession hung in the air, a devastating silence falling over the hall. The carefully constructed world of righteous certainty that Thuron and the king had built came crashing down in an instant. The nobles and elders looked from the weeping child to the sputtering inquisitor, and finally to their king, whose face had become a mask of utter shock and dawning horror. King Alaric, for the first time, saw the full scope of what had happened. He saw that his piety had been a tool, his certainty a form of blindness, and his kingdom a stage for a greedy man's ambition. He had not been cleansing his land, he had been sanctioning its destruction. His arrogance, his refusal to listen to counsel, especially from his own wife, had led him to this moment of catastrophic failure. The downfall was swift and absolute. The crowd, which had once cheered for executions, now turned on Thuron, their fear transmuting into a burning rage at his deception. The inquisitor was seized by the palace guards, his power evaporating in the face of the truth. But the crowd's anger did not stop with him. They looked at King Alaric, the ruler who had allowed this nightmare to unfold, and they saw not a divine instrument, but a foolish and arrogant man. His authority was shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, the truth settled over Ethelgard like a harsh, cleansing light. The witch trials were immediately halted, and the dungeons were opened. A stream of broken, traumatized people emerged, blinking in the sunlight. Among them was Morwen, frail and thin but alive. Elspeth and Bram wept as they embraced her, a family torn apart by fanaticism and now, miraculously, reunited. The kingdom was in ruins, but it had a chance to heal. King Alaric, a broken man, publicly confessed his sins of pride and ignorance. He abdicated the throne, passing the crown to his eldest son, a more thoughtful and compassionate ruler who had long been sidelined by his father. Alaric lived out the rest of his days in a secluded monastery, seeking a different kind of piety, one rooted in humility rather than judgment. The story of Ethelgard became a cautionary tale, whispered down through generations. It served as a stark reminder of how easily the seeds of fear can grow in the soil of rigid belief. The people learned that true evil often wears a mask of righteousness, and that the greatest strength is not found in unbending certainty, but in the courage to question, to listen, and to choose compassion over condemnation. The gray pallor of the kingdom slowly began to recede. Music and color cautiously returned, not as acts of defiance, but as expressions of a hard-won freedom. The straight and narrow path had led them to the edge of a cliff, and they had learned, at a terrible cost, that sometimes the most righteous journey is the one that allows for the grace of a winding road. The kingdom, once defined by its fear of the devil, now began the long and difficult task of learning to trust in the goodness of its own people. The healing of Ethelgard was a slow and painful process, like the mending of a shattered bone. The empty chairs at dinner tables and the fallow fields overgrown with weeds were constant, silent memorials to the lives that had been lost. The newly crowned King Valerius, Alaric's son, understood that decrees and pronouncements could not simply erase the deep wounds of mistrust that scarred his people. Justice for Inquisitor Thuron and his cronies was swift. They were tried for treason and fraud, their guilt laid bare for all to see. But punishing the architects of the nightmare was only the first step. The real challenge lay in rebuilding a society that had learned to fear itself. King Valerius, guided by the quiet wisdom of his mother, Queen Alara, began by repealing the iron covenants one by one. The stocks in the center of town were dismantled, a symbolic gesture that the era of public shamming was over. He invited scholars and thinkers from neighboring lands, men and women who spoke of reason, of natural philosophy, and of a faith that was not solely defined by fear and punishment. It was a radical shift. For generations, Ethelgard had been a closed box, impervious to outside ideas. Now its windows were being thrown open, letting in a draft of new possibilities. There was resistance, of course. Many of the village deacons and elders, whose authority had been absolute under the old regime, fought against the changes. They argued that the new king was inviting sin and chaos back into the kingdom, that the lax rules would surely bring about a new divine punishment. But the people, having seen firsthand where absolute certainty led, were wary of their dire warnings. They had traded their freedom for the promise of safety, and had received neither. Elspeth and her family slowly pieced their lives back together. Morwen, though physically recovered, carried a quiet trauma in her eyes. She found it difficult to be in crowded places, and would often fall silent for long periods, her hands restless as if they still felt the cold iron of the shackles. Bram channeled his grief and anger into his work, determined to bring his land back to life. He worked with a renewed ferocity, as if by healing the soil he could somehow heal his family's spirit. Elspeth became an unlikely voice in the village. Having witnessed the system's cruelty from the inside, she found she could no longer remain silent. When the deacon tried to preach a sermon condemning the new king's reforms, it was Elspeth who stood up in the congregation, her voice trembling but clear, and reminded everyone of the faces of the innocent who had been condemned from that very pulpit. She spoke of Finn and widow Hestia, her words painting a vivid picture of the human cost of their fanaticism. Her bravery was contagious. Others began to speak out, sharing their own stories of loss and fear. The village of Oakhaven started a process of communal grieving and reconciliation. They rebuilt the homes that had been abandoned and collectively tended the fields of families who had been torn apart. They began to understand that the evil they had feared was not an external force that crept in through the woods, but a darkness that resided within their own community, the darkness of jealousy, greed, and the willingness to believe the worst of one's neighbors. Queen Alara, now the Queen Mother, became a patron of the arts and sciences. She commissioned new music, sponsored guilds for artisans, and established a royal academy to study the natural world. She believed that the best antidote to the poison of ignorant superstition was the light of knowledge and the beauty of human creativity. Morwen, with Ilara's encouragement, returned to her loom. At first her hands were hesitant, but gradually her confidence returned. She began to weave again, and this time she did not hold back. She created tapestries filled with vibrant colors drawn from the earth, the deep blue of indigo, the bright yellow of weld, the rich red of madder root. Her creations were not just beautiful, they were acts of defiance and resilience. They told stories, not of saints and martyrs, but of the land, the seasons, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. Her tapestries became famous throughout the kingdom, symbols of Ethelgard's rebirth. People would come from miles around just to look at them, to see the color that had been forbidden for so long, and to remember that beauty was not a sin, but a gift. Years passed. The kingdom of Ethelgard transformed. It was still a devout land, but its faith was now tempered with humility and grace. The churches were still full on Sundays, but their doors were also open on weekdays for town meetings, for scholars' lectures, and for musical concerts. The children were taught not only scripture but also botany, astronomy, and history, the history of their own recent past, so that the mistakes would never be repeated. The story of King Alaric and Inquisitor Thuron was a mandatory lesson for every child. They learned how a ruler's pride and a zealot's ambition, combined with a populace paralyzed by fear, had almost destroyed them all. They learned that questioning authority was not a sign of disobedience, but a civic duty. Elspeth grew into a wise woman, a leader in her community. She never married, instead dedicating her life to ensuring that the vulnerable were protected and that justice was always tempered with mercy. She helped establish a council of villagers that would mediate disputes, ensuring that petty grievances could never again escalate into deadly accusations. She became a keeper of memories, the one who reminded them of the darkness so they would never take the light for granted. Bram and Morwen lived to see their grandchildren play in fields that were once blighted, their laughter echoing in the open air, a sound that was no longer considered a sin. The kingdom of Ethelgard never forgot its time of shadow, its season of madness. The scars remained, a part of their collective identity, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of their capacity for both great folly and great resilience, a testament to the enduring human spirit's ability to find its way out of the darkest of nights and into the hope of a new dawn. The moral of their history was woven into the very fabric of their renewed society, that the most dangerous demons are not the ones we imagine in the darkness, but the ones we create in our own hearts when we allow fear to extinguish our humanity. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious world of the accused and their stories. A story filled with whispers of power, betrayal, and secrets the old world tried to bury. There are moments in history that make you wonder how far humans could go for pride, for greed, or for survival, and this one is among them. So before you settle in, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room, and if you truly enjoy calm but dark storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through forgotten history. Now let's drift back in time together. In the kingdom of Eldoria, nestled between jagged mountains and a restless sea, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a land of breathtaking beauty, with rolling green hills that kissed the clouds and ancient forests where the trees whispered secrets to one another. But beneath this veneer of tranquility, a current of fear ran deep, a quiet poison that seeped into the very soil. The people of Eldoria were ruled by King Thuron, a man whose heart was as cold and unyielding as the iron of his crown. His reign had begun with promises of prosperity, but soon descended into a chilling spectacle of power, where justice was a commodity and accusations were weapons. The king had an insatiable appetite for control, and he fed it by turning his own people against one another, sowing seeds of mistrust that blossomed into a harvest of sorrow. At the heart of this fear was a set of laws Thuron himself had decreed, laws so strange and arbitrary that no one ever truly felt safe. There was the law of unbecoming conduct, which could mean anything from a shared glance deemed too familiar to a laugh that was judged too loud in the market square. Then there was the infamous edict of silent suspicions, which made it a crime not to report a neighbor for any perceived wrongdoing, no matter how trivial. Failure to report was seen as complicity, and the punishment was often as severe for the silent as it was for the accused. In the small, sun-drenched village of Oakhaven, nestled at the edge of the Whispering Woods, lived a young woman named Alara. She was a weaver, her hands nimble and skilled, capable of turning simple threads into tapestries that told stories of ancient heroes and forgotten magic. Alara was known for her kindness and her quiet nature, her smile as warm and gentle as the morning sun. Her world was a simple one, revolving around the rhythmic clatter of her loom, the scent of fresh bread from the village baker, and the comforting presence of her aging father, a retired stonemason whose hands, though gnarled with age, still held a quiet strength. Alara's life was a tapestry of its own, woven with threads of peace and contentment. But in Eldoria, peace was a fragile thing, easily torn. Her story, like so many others, began not with an act of malice, but with a simple act of kindness that was twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. An old woman in the village, Morwen, had fallen on hard times. Her husband had passed, and she struggled to tend to her small plot of land. Alara, seeing her plight, would often leave a small bundle of food on Morwen's doorstep, a loaf of bread, a handful of vegetables from her garden, a small piece of cheese. She did this in secret, under the cloak of twilight, seeking no thanks, only wishing to ease another's burden. This small act of charity did not go unnoticed. Kale, the village warden and a man whose ambition far outstripped his compassion, saw Alara's quiet visits. Kale had long desired the respect and favor of the king's court, and he knew that delivering an accused, any accused, would earn him a small measure of recognition. He saw not kindness in Alara's actions, but conspiracy. Why would a young woman visit a reclusive old widow in secret? What were they plotting? Under the edict of silent suspicions, Kale was not just permitted to be suspicious, he was obligated to be. He began to watch Alara, his eyes following her every move, his mind twisting her innocence into a web of deceit. He noted how she sometimes hummed old folk songs while she worked, songs that spoke of a time before King Thuron, a time of greater freedom. In his report to the regional magistrate, these became seditious anthems. He observed how she would sometimes gather herbs from the Whispering Woods, herbs her mother had taught her to use for healing teas and poultices. In his tainted narrative, this became evidence of witchcraft, of brewing dark potions. The day they came for Alara was a day the sun refused to shine. The sky was a blanket of oppressive gray, and a cold wind swept through Oakhaven, carrying with it the scent of rain and fear. Two of the king's guard, their armor clanking with grim finality, strode into her small cottage without a word. Her father, confused and frail, tried to stand in their way, but he was shoved aside with casual cruelty. Ilara was at her loom, her hands frozen mid-motion, a thread of vibrant blue held between her fingers. She looked at the guards, her eyes wide with a confusion that had not yet given way to terror. They accused her of unbecoming conduct in consorting with known witches, a charge so absurd that for a moment, Ilara thought it was a terrible mistake. She looked for an explanation, for a familiar face, and saw Cale standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of feigned regret and triumphant pride. It was then that she understood. Her simple acts of kindness had been her undoing. The guards dragged her from her home, her father's cries echoing behind her, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The villagers of Oakhaven watched from their windows, their faces pale with fear. They knew Ilara. They knew her goodness. But the edict of silent suspicions had made them all prisoners in their own homes, too afraid to speak out, lest they be the next to be dragged away. Ilara was taken to the capital city, to the infamous Blackstone Keep, a place from which few returned. The keep was a monument to King Thuron's paranoia, a labyrinth of cold stone, damp corridors, and cells that had not seen the light of day in centuries. Here the accused were not tried, they were broken. The king had a particular fondness for a cruel form of interrogation, known as the weighing of the soul. The accused would be bound to a chair, and a panel of inquisitors, their faces hidden behind stern iron masks, would ask a series of impossible questions. Did you dance in the moonlight to summon spirits? Did you curse the king's name in your heart? Did you conspire to bring about a blight on the kingdom's crops? Any answer was the wrong answer. A denial was seen as proof of a deceitful nature. A confession, often extracted through exhaustion and fear, was taken as absolute truth. There was no room for innocence in Blackstone Keep. There was only guilt, and the degree of it was determined not by evidence, but by the whims of the inquisitors. Ilara, a simple weaver from a quiet village, found herself in this nightmare. Her story was not unique. In the cell next to hers was a farmer named Ronan, a large, gentle man whose only crime was that his fields had yielded a better harvest than those of a nobleman who coveted his land. The nobleman had accused him of using dark magic to enrich his soil, and that was all it took. Across the hall was a young nobleman himself, Lord Perrin, whose sharp wit and quiet disapproval of the king's policies had been misconstrued as treason. He had made a careless joke at a royal banquet, a jest that was carried by eager ears straight to the king. The stories of the accused filled the damp air of the dungeons, whispered from cell to cell in the dead of night. They were tales of ordinary people, caught in the gears of a machine they could not comprehend. A baker whose bread was too perfect, a minstrel whose songs were too melancholic, a scholar whose books contained ideas deemed dangerous. Each story was a testament to how easily a life could be shattered by a single word, a single suspicion. King Thuron reveled in these proceedings. He would often watch the interrogations from behind a tapestry, his presence a chilling, unseen weight in the room. He believed he was purging his kingdom of weakness, of dissent, of anything that did not bend to his will. He did not see people, he saw threats. He did not hear pleas for mercy. He heard the satisfying creak of his power tightening its grip. His queen, a woman named Lyra, was a stark contrast to her husband. She was a gentle soul, trapped in a golden cage, her heart aching for the people her husband terrorized. She had tried to reason with him in the early days of his reign, to temper his cruelty with compassion, but her words were like water on stone. He saw her kindness as a weakness, a flaw to be controlled. So she learned to be silent, her sorrow a constant, quiet companion. She would walk the castle gardens at night, the scent of moon-drenched roses a poor substitute for the freedom she and her people had lost. Alara's interrogation was a blur of fear and confusion. The masked inquisitors' voices droned on, their questions a tangled mess of nonsense and accusation. They spoke of pacts with shadow creatures, of secret covens in the woods, of a plot to unravel the very fabric of the kingdom. She denied it all, her voice growing weaker with each passing hour. She spoke of her loom, of the colors of the threads, of her father's kind eyes. She tried to make them see the simple truth of her life. But they were not interested in truth. They were interested in a confession. They left her in the darkness, with only the dripping of water and the distant moans of other prisoners for company. Days bled into nights. She lost track of time, her world shrinking to the 4 damp walls of her cell. Yet in that darkness, a flicker of her spirit refused to be extinguished. She would hum the old folk songs, not as an act of defiance, but as a way to remember who she was, a way to hold onto the memory of sunshine and the scent of wood smoke from her village. The farmer Ronan would sometimes hear her humming and would tap gently on the wall, a small, rhythmic beat that said, "I am still here. You are not alone." Lord Perrin, in the cell across the hall, would occasionally recite lines of poetry, his voice a low, steady murmur, a reminder that beauty and art could exist even in the deepest despair. Meanwhile, back in Oakhaven, a quiet change was taking root. Ilara's abduction had been a shock, a brutal splash of cold water that awakened the villagers from their fearful slumber. Her father, broken-hearted but not defeated, began to speak to his neighbors. He did not speak of rebellion, not at first. He spoke of Ilara, of her kindness, of the injustice of it all. He reminded them of the community they once were, before the king's laws had turned them into suspicious strangers. He spoke of the edict of silent suspicions, and how it had made them complicit in the kingdom's cruelty. His words, spoken in hushed tones over fences and in the dim light of the tavern, were like seeds falling on fertile ground. The villagers began to look at Kale, the warden, with new eyes. They saw the smug satisfaction on his face, the way he strutted through the village as if he were a lord. They saw him not as a protector of the law, but as a petty tyrant who had sacrificed one of their own for his own gain. The fear that had held them captive began to curdle into a slow-burning anger. It was a dangerous feeling in a kingdom like Eldoria, but it was also a spark of hope. Within the castle walls, Queen Lyra was also stirring from her quiet despair. She had heard the whispers of the guards, the tales of the weaver girl who hummed in the dungeons. She had seen the ever-growing list of the accused, their names and their supposed crimes a testament to her husband's escalating paranoia. She could no longer stand by and watch her kingdom bleed. She began to act in secret, using the network of handmaidens and servants who were loyal to her. She sent messages, small scraps of parchment hidden in baskets of laundry or tucked into the spines of books. Her first message was to a man she had not spoken to in years, her uncle, Lord Valerius, a respected nobleman who had retired to his remote estate in the northern mountains after a falling out with the king. Valerius was a man of honor and integrity, one of the few who had dared to question Thuron's methods in the past. Lyra's message was simple. The loom is silent, but the whispers are growing. Eldoria needs a master weaver to mend its broken threads. Valerius understood. It was a call to action, a plea for help. Lord Valerius was a patient man, a strategist who knew that a direct confrontation with the king would be suicide. Thuron's power was absolute, his network of spies and loyalists extensive. To challenge him openly would be to invite destruction. Instead, Valerius began to work in the shadows, just as Lyra was doing. He started to contact other nobles, men and women of influence who had grown disillusioned with the king's tyranny. He did not speak of treason or rebellion. He spoke of justice, of restoring balance, of reminding the king of his duty to his people, not just to his own power. He used the stories of the accused as his evidence, the story of Elara the weaver, of Ronan the farmer, of Lord Perrin the poet. These were not faceless criminals. They were good people, the very heart of the kingdom, and they were being systematically destroyed. The nobles listened. They too had felt the chill of the king's paranoia. Many had lost friends or family members to the dungeons of Blackstone Keep. They had seen their own power and influence erode as the king consolidated all authority in his own hands. They were afraid, but Valerius's quiet, determined leadership gave them a sliver of courage. Back in the dungeon, Elara, Ronan, and Perrin had formed an unlikely bond. Through the stone walls that separated them, they shared their stories, their hopes, and their fears. Perrin, with his knowledge of law and history, began to piece together the true nature of the king's tyranny. He explained that the laws were intentionally vague, designed to be a net that could catch anyone at any time. He spoke of how fear was the king's greatest weapon, for it isolated people and made them easier to control. Ronan, with his earthy wisdom, spoke of the land, of the cycles of planting and harvesting. He reminded them that even the longest winter must eventually give way to spring. His steadfast hope was a balm to their weary souls. And Elara, with her quiet strength, became the heart of their small, captive community. Her humming, the soft, resilient sound of her voice, was a constant reminder of the life that existed beyond the stone and iron. She wove stories in their minds, just as she had once woven them on her loom, tales of courage, of love, of a world where kindness was not a crime. The plan formulated by Lord Valerius and Queen Lyra was a risky one, a delicate dance on the edge of a razor. It was not a plan of swords and sieges, but of truth and exposure. They decided to use the king's own system against him. The annual solstice festival was approaching, a time when the king would hold a grand court, inviting nobles from all corners of the kingdom to the capital. It was meant to be a display of his power and magnificence. Valerius and Lyra planned to turn it into a trial of the king himself. Through Lyra's network, a message was smuggled into Blackstone Keep, a message for Lord Perrin. It was a complex legal argument, a loophole in the king's own laws that had been overlooked. The law stated that any accused had the right to face their accuser in a court of high justice, provided they could present a petition signed by a nobleman of standing. It was a right that had never been invoked, for no nobleman had ever dared to sign such a petition. But Valerius was prepared to be the first, and the court of high justice was the king's grand court at the solstice festival. The plan was set in motion. Perrin, using a piece of charcoal and a scrap of linen smuggled to him by a sympathetic guard in Lyra's employ, painstakingly copied the legal argument. He then shared it with Elara and Ronan. They would not confess. They would not break. They would demand their right to a trial. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than fatting away in the darkness. The next time the inquisitors came, They were met not with tears and denials, but with a calm, unified demand. Ilara, her voice clear and steady, requested a trial. Ronan, his large frame unbowed, echoed her demand. And Perrin, with the cool precision of a scholar, presented the legal basis for their request. The inquisitors were stunned. This was unheard of. They took the demand to the king, expecting him to laugh it off and order the prisoners to be punished for their insolence. But King Thuron, for all his cruelty, was also a man of immense arrogance. He was so convinced of his own absolute power that the idea of a public trial amused him. He saw it as an opportunity to make an example of these defiant prisoners, to show all of Eldoria the futility of resisting his will. He granted the trial, a decision born of hubris that would prove to be his undoing. As the day of the solstice festival approached, a palpable tension settled over the capital. The city was adorned with banners and flags, but there was no joy in the air. The people knew that this was not a festival, but a spectacle. Lord Valerius arrived at the capital with a retinue of other powerful nobles, their faces grim and determined. They had all agreed to stand with him, to lend their voices to the call for justice. In Oakhaven, Ilara's father, along with a delegation of villagers, made the long journey to the capital. They brought with them a simple tapestry, one of Ilara's creations that they had saved from her cottage. It depicted a scene of a community working together, of people helping one another, a silent testament to the values she was being punished for. The stage was set in the great hall of the castle, a cavernous room with a high, vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows that depicted glorious battles from Eldoria's history. King Thuron sat on his throne of iron and gold, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Queen Lyra sat beside him, her face a mask of calm, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Ilara, Ronan, and Perrin were brought before the court. They were pale and thin from their time in the dungeons, but their eyes held a fire that had not been extinguished. Kale, the village warden, was there to act as Ilara's accuser. The nobleman who had coveted Ronan's land was there, and the courtier who had reported Perrin's joke stood ready to give his testimony. The trial began, and at first it went exactly as the king had planned. The accusers spun their tales, twisting innocence into guilt, their words dripping with feigned piety and concern for the kingdom's well-being. The king listened with satisfaction, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, daring anyone to question the proceedings. But then it was time for the defense. Lord Valerius rose, his voice calm but powerful, filling the silent hall. He did not challenge the accusers directly. Instead, he began to call witnesses of his own. He first called Ilara's father to the stand. The old stonemason, his voice trembling but his words clear, spoke of his daughter's kindness, of her gentle spirit. He held up the tapestry, and its simple, honest beauty seemed to rebuke the ugliness of the accusations. Then Valerius called other villagers from Oakhaven. One by one, they spoke of the secret gifts of food left on Morwen's doorstep, of the healing teas Ilara had made for the sick, of the songs she sang that brought comfort to the weary. They spoke of the fear that had kept them silent, and the shame they now felt for their silence. They looked at Kale, and their collective gaze was an indictment far more powerful than any legal argument. The crowd began to murmur, the sound like the rustling of leaves before a storm. The king's smirk began to fade, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. This was not the quick, decisive condemnation he had envisioned. Next, Valerius addressed Ronan's case. He called forth agricultural experts from across the kingdom, old farmers who had tilled the soil for decades. They testified that Ronan's methods were not magic, but skill and hard work. They explained the science of crop rotation and soil enrichment, their practical wisdom making the nobleman's accusations of witchcraft sound childish and absurd. The nobleman, under Valerius's sharp questioning, was forced to admit his jealousy, his desire for Ronan's land. The murmuring in the hall grew louder. The foundation of the king's justice was beginning to crack. Finally, Valerius turned to Lord Perrin's case. He did not deny that Perrin had made a joke. Instead, he asked for the joke to be repeated. The courtier, flustered, stammered out the jest, a rather clever but harmless quip about the weight of the king's crown. In the oppressive silence of the hall, the joke was not treasonous. It was simply a joke. Valerius then began to read from Eldoria's own ancient legal texts, texts that Thuron had ignored. He spoke of the long-held traditions of free speech, of the difference between dissent and treason. He argued that a kingdom that could not tolerate a single jest was a kingdom built on fear, not strength. The climax came when Queen Lyra, in a move that stunned the entire court, rose from her throne. All eyes turned to her. She had been a silent, decorative figure for so long that her voice, when it came, was a shock. It was soft, but it carried to every corner of the hall. She did not speak of laws or evidence. She spoke of the soul of Eldoria. She spoke of the fear she saw in the eyes of the people, of the constant suspicion that had poisoned their lives. She looked directly at her husband, and for the first time in years, there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound and sorrowful disappointment. A king's strength is not measured by the number of his prisoners, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, but by the trust of his people. We have traded trust for terror, and the price is the very heart of our kingdom. King Thuron was livid. He leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. He bellowed for the guards to seize Valerius, to seize his own wife, to drag the prisoners back to the dungeons. But for the first time, the guards hesitated. They looked at the assembled nobles, who had all risen to their feet in a silent show of solidarity with Valerius. They looked at the crowd, at the faces of the common people, no longer cowed into submission, but filled with a righteous anger. They looked at their enraged king, and they saw not a powerful ruler, but a tyrant who had lost control. In that moment of hesitation, the spell of fear was broken. The king's power, which had always seemed so absolute, was revealed to be a fragile illusion, held together only by the silence of the oppressed. When no one moved to obey his command, Thuron's rage curdled into a desperate panic. He was alone, a king with no subjects, a commander with no soldiers. The arrogance that had been his shield now crumbled, leaving him exposed and pathetic. The downfall of King Thuron was not swift and bloody. It was quiet and absolute. Stripped of his authority by the unified will of the nobles and the people, he was escorted from the great hall, his reign over. He was exiled to a remote coastal fortress, left to spend the rest of his days with nothing but the roaring of the sea and the echoes of his own failed tyranny for company. Lord Valerius, with the support of the council of nobles and the queen, was appointed as regent, tasked with healing the deep wounds the king had inflicted upon the kingdom. The first act of the new council was to throw open the gates of Blackstone Keep. A stream of prisoners emerged, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, their faces etched with the stories of their suffering. Families were reunited, tears of sorrow mingling with tears of joy. The strange and cruel laws of King Thuron were publicly burned in the city square, the smoke from the pyre a symbol of purification, of a new beginning. Ilara, Ronan, and Perrin were declared heroes. They had not sought to be, but their quiet refusal to surrender their dignity had ignited the spark of change. Perrin became a key advisor to Lord Valerius, his sharp mind and deep understanding of justice helping to craft a new, fairer set of laws for Eldoria. Ronan returned to his farm, his land now safe, and he became a respected leader in his community, teaching others his skilled farming techniques. And Ilara returned to Oakhaven. The journey home was a stark contrast to the one that had brought her to the capital. This time she was not a prisoner, but a symbol of hope. The villagers of Oakhaven welcomed her with open arms, their shame at their previous silence now replaced with a fierce pride. Kael, the warden, had fled the village in disgrace, unable to face the people he had betrayed. Ilara went back to her cottage, to her father, and to her loom. But she was not the same woman who had been dragged away. The threads she now wove were different. They were richer, more complex. She still wove tales of heroes and magic, but she also wove the stories of the accused, the tales she had heard whispered in the darkness of the dungeons. She wove the story of Ronan, the gentle farmer, and Perrin, the wise lord. She wove the story of the silent queen who found her voice, and the brave nobleman who dared to speak the truth. Her tapestries became famous throughout Eldoria, not just for their beauty, but for their honesty. They were a reminder of the darkness the kingdom had endured, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Eldoria serves as a quiet, enduring lesson. It teaches us that tyranny thrives not only on the cruelty of the oppressor, but on the silence of the good. It shows that ordinary people, when pushed to the brink, can find extraordinary courage. The most powerful chains are not forged from iron, but from fear, and the key to breaking them lies in the simple, brave act of speaking the truth, of standing together, of remembering our shared humanity. The whispers of suspicion that once haunted the kingdom were replaced by the sounds of a community rebuilding itself, a testament to the idea that even after the most brutal of winters, spring will eventually return, bringing with it the promise of healing and of hope. The air in Eldoria began to change slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the turning of a great silent wheel. The heavy cloak of fear that had smothered the kingdom for so long began to lift, thread by thread, allowing shafts of light to pierce the gloom. Lord Valerius, as regent, understood that rebuilding the kingdom was not merely a matter of changing laws, but of mending the broken trust between the people and those who governed them. He traveled the land, not with the pomp and ceremony of a king, but with a small entourage, visiting towns and villages, listening to the stories of the people. He sat in taverns and by hearth fires, sharing bread and ale, and for the first time in a generation, the people of Eldoria felt that their voices were being heard. He dismantled the network of spies that Thuron had created, replacing the wardens and magistrates who had abused their power with men and women chosen for their integrity and wisdom. The Edict of Silent Suspicions was replaced with a charter of neighborly duty, which encouraged people to support one another, framing community as a source of strength, not a web of potential conspirators. Queen Lyra, no longer a captive in her own castle, became a champion for the forgotten victims of her husband's reign. She established a fund to help the families who had been torn apart by false accusations, providing them with resources to rebuild their lives. She often visited Ilara in Oakhaven, the two women, a queen and a weaver, finding a common bond in their shared desire to create a better world. They would sit together by Ilara's loom, the queen watching, mesmerized, as Ilara's hands danced across the threads, turning scenes of sorrow into panels of redemption. Inspired by Ilara's work, the queen commissioned a great tapestry to hang in the main hall of the castle, the very room where the trial had taken place. It was to be a collaborative work, a tapestry woven by many hands, each section telling a different story of an ordinary person who had suffered under Thuron's rule. It was to be called the People's Memory, a permanent and visible reminder that the strength of a kingdom lay not in its ruler, but in the collective heart of its people. The project became a phenomenon. Weavers from all over Eldoria contributed panels. A fisherman from the coast wove a square depicting his brother, who had been accused of treason for mending the nets of a foreign sailor. A blacksmith from the northern mountains sent a piece showing his daughter, a spirited girl who had been imprisoned for laughing too loudly during a royal procession. Each panel was a small act of defiance, a reclamation of a story that had been stolen and twisted. Ilara's role was to weave them all together, to find the common threads that bound these disparate tales of injustice into a single, coherent narrative. As she worked, she felt she was not just weaving cloth, but mending the very fabric of their society. The tapestry grew, a vibrant and heartbreaking mosaic of a kingdom's pain and its slow, arduous journey toward healing. It showed the dark dungeons of Blackstone Keep, the masked faces of the inquisitors, and the lonely, terrified figures of the accused. But it also showed the acts of kindness that had defied the darkness, the shared crust of bread in a prison cell, the whispered words of encouragement, the steadfast loyalty of a friend. While this public healing took place, the shadow of King Thuron still lingered. From his exile in the coastal fortress of Saltspire, he brooded. His arrogance did not allow for self-reflection or remorse. It only festered into a burning desire for revenge. He saw the changes in his kingdom not as progress, but as a betrayal. He still had loyalists, those who had benefited from his corrupt system, who missed the power and influence they had wielded. From his fortress prison, Thuron began to smuggle out messages, weaving a new web of conspiracy, this time not with the threads of false accusation, but with promises of power and wealth to those who would help him reclaim his throne. His chief conspirator was a disgruntled nobleman, Lord Malachar, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. Malachar had been one of Thuron's most enthusiastic enforcers, and he had been stripped of his lands and titles by the new council. He saw Thuron's return as his only path back to glory. They planned their coup to coincide with the unveiling of the People's Memory tapestry. The ceremony was to be a grand national event, a symbolic closing of a dark chapter and the beginning of a new one. Nobles and commoners from across Eldoria would gather in the capital, their attention focused on the celebration. It was the perfect moment to strike, to sow chaos and reclaim power while the kingdom was distracted by its own healing. The plot was insidious. Malachar's men would infiltrate the capital, disguised as merchants and travelers. A select few would gain access to the castle as guards, using forged documents. Their plan was to assassinate Lord Valerius during the ceremony, capture the queen, and install Malachar as a puppet ruler until Thuron could be brought back from exile. They would then declare the new laws void and reinstate the old order, plunging Eldoria back into an age of fear. The kingdom, still fragile in its recovery, was blissfully unaware of the serpent coiling in its midst. The day of the unveiling dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day. The capital was alive with a festive energy that felt genuine and joyous, a stark contrast to the forced celebrations of the past. Ilara, her father, Ronan, and Lord Perrin stood near the front of the great hall, their hearts full. The immense tapestry covered an entire wall, hidden for now behind a simple velvet curtain. Queen Lyra and Lord Valerius stood on a dais, ready to address the crowd. As Lord Valerius began to speak, his voice filled with hope for the future, Ilara felt a strange sense of unease. She noticed a guard near the dais, a man whose face was unfamiliar. There was something in his eyes, a cold, predatory glint that did not belong in this place of peace. He was watching Valerius not with the deference of a guard, but with the focused intensity of a hunter. Her weaver's eye, so accustomed to noticing the smallest detail, the single thread out of place, saw that the hilt of the guard's sword was wrapped in a black leather cord, tied in a specific knot. It was a knot she had seen before, on the uniform of one of the king's personal inquisitors who had escorted her to Blackstone Keep. Her blood ran cold. It was a small detail, something no one else would notice, but to her, it was a glaring flaw in the pattern. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked around and saw two other men dressed as servants, their postures too rigid, their gazes too sharp. They were slowly, almost casually, moving to flank the queen. The beautiful tapestry she had helped create, a symbol of truth and memory, was about to become the backdrop for another tragedy. She had to do something. There was no time to explain, no time to find someone in authority. The first guard's hand was already moving towards his sword. Without a second thought, Ilara acted. She grabbed a heavy ceremonial brazier filled with burning incense that stood nearby. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she swung it with all her might, not at the guard, but at the massive velvet curtain covering the tapestry. The heavy brazier tore through the fabric, and the curtain, its support ripped, came crashing down, revealing the tapestry in all its magnificent, heartbreaking glory. The sudden noise and the dramatic unveiling of the tapestry startled everyone. The crowd gasped, their attention momentarily diverted. It was the only distraction Ilara needed. She screamed treason. The guards are false. Her voice, though not loud, was sharp with such genuine terror that it cut through the murmuring of the crowd. The false guard, his moment of surprise lost, drew his sword and lunged towards Lord Valerius. But his surprise attack had been foiled. Ronan, the big farmer who had been standing near Ilara, reacted instantly. With a mighty roar, he threw himself in front of Valerius, not with a weapon, but with his own body. He caught the assassin's arm, his farmer's strength, honed by years of manual labor, more than a match for the swordsman. The other conspirators, seeing their plan exposed, drew their own weapons, and the great hall erupted into chaos. But Malaker's men were vastly outnumbered. The loyal guards, now alerted to the threat, swarmed the assassins. The nobles drew their own ceremonial swords to defend the queen. The common people, who in the past would have fled in terror, now stood their ground, some even joining the fray, using whatever they could find as weapons. They were no longer a cowed populace. They were a people fighting for their newly won freedom. The attempted coup was over in minutes. Lord Malaker was captured, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The assassins were disarmed and taken into custody. In the aftermath, as calm was slowly restored, the full weight of what had happened settled upon the crowd. They had been on the precipice of returning to the darkness, and they had been saved, not by an army, but by the sharp eyes of a weaver and the courage of a farmer. Ilara, trembling, was brought before Queen Lyra and Lord Valerius. They looked at her, their eyes filled with a gratitude that words could not express. "You saw the misplaced thread," the queen said, her voice soft with wonder. Ilara simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the magnificent tapestry that now hung fully revealed for all to see. In its threads they could see their past, their pain, their resilience. And now it had a new story to tell, the story of this day, of how the memory of injustice had armed them against its return. Lord Malachar and his co-conspirators were given a fair trial, the very thing they would have denied others. They were found guilty of treason and, like the king they sought to restore, were exiled, their power broken for good. The failed coup had an unintended consequence. Instead of shattering the kingdom's fragile peace, it solidified it. The people had faced the ghosts of their past and had not flinched. They had proven to themselves that they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. Eldoria entered a true age of peace and prosperity. The story of the weaver who saved the kingdom became a beloved tale, a reminder that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, and that paying attention to the small details can make all the difference. Ilara never sought a title or a reward. She returned to her quiet life in Oakhaven, to her loom and her father. But her life was never truly the same. She was a respected elder, a wise woman whose counsel was sought by many. Her tapestries were treasured, each one a lesson in history, a story of the delicate and complex pattern of human life. The great people's memory, tapestry, remained in the great hall, a constant reminder to all future rulers of Eldoria of where true power lay. It taught them that a kingdom's foundation is not built on iron and gold, but on the trust and dignity of its people. And it whispered a timeless truth, that the stories of the accused, the silenced, and the forgotten when brought into the light hold the power not just to expose the darkness, but to weave a future of hope, courage, and enduring peace. The loom in Ilara's cottage continued its rhythmic clatter for many, many years, its sound a steady heartbeat in a kingdom that had finally, truly healed. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mysterious world of trials, punishments, and legacy. A story filled with whispers of power, betrayal, and secrets the old world tried to bury. There are moments in history that make you wonder how far humans could go for pride, for greed, or for survival, and this one is among them. So before you settle in, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room, and if you truly enjoy calm but dark storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through forgotten history. Now let's drift back in time together. In the shadowed heart of the kingdom of Eldoria, where ancient forests whispered secrets to the wind and towering castles cast long, imposing shadows, there lived a king named Thuron. He was a man of stern demeanor, his face etched with the burdens of 1,000 minor anxieties, and his heart a fortress of suspicion. His queen, Ilara, a woman of ethereal beauty and quiet grace, often found herself navigating the treacherous currents of his unpredictable moods. The kingdom, though outwardly prosperous, simmered with an undercurrent of fear, a fear carefully cultivated by the king's most trusted advisor, a man known only as Malachar. Malachar was a figure of unsettling charisma. His eyes, like polished obsidian, seemed to peer into the very souls of those he addressed. He spoke of dark omens and ancient curses, his words weaving a tapestry of dread that entangled the minds of the common folk and the nobles alike. It was in this climate of engineered apprehension that the whispers began, insidious and faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, then growing louder, more insistent, until they echoed through the very halls of power. These whispers spoke of witchcraft, of dark pacts made in moonlit clearings, of ailments and misfortunes attributed to unseen, malevolent forces. The first to be accused was old Ilara, a simple village herbalist, whose gnarled hands had mended broken bones and soothed fevered brows for generations. Her crime, according to a young, overly zealous guard, was the uncanny ability to predict a coming storm, a prediction that had, coincidentally, proven true. Malachar, with a chillingly persuasive voice, presented this as undeniable proof of her unnatural powers. The king, already predisposed to believe in the supernatural as a means to explain the inexplicable, readily agreed to a trial. The trial itself was a spectacle of medieval justice, or rather injustice. It was held in the great hall of the castle, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and the nervous murmurs of the assembled crowd. Old Ilara, frail and bewildered, stood before a hastily assembled panel of judges, their faces grim and unyielding. The evidence against her was flimsy at best. A few whispered rumors, a suspicious glance caught by a peasant, the unproven claim that her herbal concoctions worked too well. No one dared speak in her defense, for fear of being tainted by the same accusation. Under the harsh interrogation, old Ilara, utterly terrified and unable to comprehend the accusations leveled against her, confessed to things she hadn't done, simply to make the torment stop. She spoke of shadows and voices, of a desire to help her village, twisted by her accusers into an admission of dark dealings. Her confession, extracted under duress and fear, was deemed sufficient by the court. The sentence was swift and brutal, execution by hanging, a stark warning to anyone else who might dare to dabble in the forbidden arts. Her death, a quiet, mournful event, was witnessed by a silent, terrified crowd, each person wondering if they might be next. The execution of old Ilara was not an end but a beginning. It ignited a spark of paranoia that quickly consumed Eldoria. Malachar, seeing the king's willingness to believe, expertly fanned the flames of suspicion. He introduced new, unusual laws that made even the most innocent actions appear suspicious. A woman who owned too many cats, a man who spoke with a foreign accent, a child who had an unusual birthmark, all became potential candidates for accusations of witchcraft. The definition of a witch broadened to encompass anyone who was different, anyone who challenged the status quo, anyone who dared to question the king's authority or Malachar's increasingly sinister influence. The trials that followed were far from fair. They were characterized by a chilling lack of due process. Accusations were enough to secure an arrest. The accused were often subjected to unspeakable cruelty, designed to extract confessions. The swimming test became common. Suspected witches were bound and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were deemed guilty, as water, being pure, would reject a witch. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent though dead. This barbaric practice, a perversion of justice, was justified by the chilling logic that only the guilty would survive. The peasants, already living precarious lives, were caught in a horrifying bind. They feared being accused themselves, and so they often turned on their neighbors, their friends, even their family members, hoping to deflect suspicion. A peasant named Thomas, a respected farmer, was accused because his crops consistently yielded more than his neighbors. His success was attributed to dark magic, not his years of hard work and knowledge of the land. His wife, distraught and terrified for their children, tried to defend him, only to find herself also accused. They were both subjected to the ordeal by fire, forced to walk over hot coals. Their agonizing screams were dismissed as the wails of the damned, their burns as proof of their unholy alliance. They perished, leaving behind orphaned children and a community steeped in fear. The nobility, initially thinking themselves immune, soon found themselves entangled in Malaker's web. Lord Valerius, a powerful duke who had openly expressed concerns about the escalating hysteria, was accused of harboring a witch within his household. The witch was his own daughter, Lady Isolde, a quiet, scholarly young woman who spent her days immersed in ancient texts. Her crime, according to Malaker, was her unusual intelligence and her habit of reading strange books late into the night. She was accused of practicing dark rituals to gain forbidden knowledge. Lord Valerius, outraged, demanded a proper trial, presenting eloquent arguments for his daughter's innocence. But Malaker had already poisoned the king's mind. The king, growing increasingly paranoid and reliant on Malaker's counsel, saw Valerius's defense as defiance, a challenge to his own judgment. Lady Isolde was subjected to the pricking test, where sharp needles were used to find insensitive spots on her body, believed to be the devil's mark. Every flinch, every tear, was interpreted as further proof of her guilt. She was condemned, and Lord Valerius, heartbroken and broken, was powerless to save her. Her execution, a public burning, was a terrifying display of the king's absolute power and Malaker's chilling influence. It sent a clear message to any noble who dared to question the new order. Queen Alara watched in silent horror as her kingdom descended into madness. She tried to reason with King Thuron, her soft pleas falling on deaf ears. He dismissed her concerns as a woman's weakness, a lack of understanding of the grave threats facing Eldoria. His arrogance grew with each successful prosecution, each confession extracted through torture. He truly believed he was purging his kingdom of evil, a righteous defender against the encroaching darkness. Malaker skillfully manipulated this belief, ensuring the king remained blind to the true nature of his actions. As the years passed, the trials continued, claiming more and more innocent lives. The kingdom became a place of whispers and shadows, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. Farmers abandoned their fields, merchants closed their shops, and the vibrant life that once pulsed through Eldoria began to fade. The people lived in a constant state of terror, their days filled with anxiety, their nights with nightmares. The economy suffered, as skilled laborers and intelligent minds, fearing accusation, either fled or were executed. One day, a young peasant boy named Finn, whose grandmother had been among the first victims, overheard a hushed conversation between two of Malaker's guards. They spoke of forged letters, of bribes paid by powerful rivals to frame certain nobles, and of Malaker's vast network of informants, many of whom were coerced into giving false testimonies. Finn, though terrified, understood the gravity of what he had heard. He knew he had to do something, even if it meant risking his own life. He sought out an old, reclusive monk named Brother Marcus, who lived in a secluded monastery high in the mountains. Brother Marcus was known for his wisdom and his quiet resistance to the king's increasingly tyrannical rule. Finn, trembling with fear, recounted everything he had heard. Brother Marcus, his eyes filled with sorrow and a renewed sense of purpose, listened patiently. He recognized the pattern of calculated deceit, a pattern he had seen hinted at in old texts describing the downfall of other kingdoms. Together they began to gather evidence, working in utmost secrecy. It was a perilous task, for Malaker's reach was long and his informants numerous. They sought out those who had been forced to give false testimonies, offering them solace and protection in exchange for their true stories. They discovered forged documents, letters implicating innocent individuals, and ledgers detailing the vast sums of money Malaker had amassed through his cruel reign of terror. The climax of their efforts came during a grand feast held in the castle, a celebration of another successful witch trial. King Thuron, beaming with self-congratulation, sat on his throne surrounded by his remaining, increasingly nervous nobles. Malaker at his side exuded an air of triumphant authority. As the feast was in full swing, Brother Marcus, accompanied by Finn and a few brave, loyal guards, burst into the hall. Brother Marcus, holding aloft a stack of incriminating documents, addressed the king in a voice that resonated with quiet power. He laid bare Malaker's deceit, presenting irrefutable proof of his treachery, his manipulation, and the countless innocent lives he had condemned for his own gain. The forged letters, the coerced confessions, the fabricated evidence, it was all there, meticulously documented. The hall fell silent, the festive atmosphere shattered by the shocking revelations. King Thuron, at first, roared with indignation, refusing to believe that his trusted advisor could have so cunningly deceived him. His arrogance, however, began to crack as he saw the irrefutable evidence, the faces of those who had been forced to lie, now bravely stepping forward to testify against Malaker. The queen, Ilara, who had been observing in silent despair, finally spoke, her voice clear and strong, corroborating many of Brother Marcus's claims, speaking of her own attempts to warn the king. The truth, stark and undeniable, hit King Thuron with the force of a physical blow. The realization that he had been a puppet, a tool in Malaker's cruel game, was a bitter pill to swallow. His face, usually a mask of stern authority, contorted with a mixture of rage, shame, and disbelief. He saw the horror in the eyes of his nobles, the quiet relief in the faces of his peasants, and finally, the profound disappointment in the gaze of his queen. Malaker, his usual composure crumbling, attempted to flee, but he was swiftly apprehended by the guards. His cries of innocence were drowned out by the rising tide of anger and disgust from the assembled court. King Thuron, his voice trembling with a fury born of betrayal, ordered Malaker's immediate arrest and a thorough investigation into all his past dealings. The trials that followed were vastly different from those Malaker had orchestrated. This time, true justice was sought. Malaker and his co-conspirators were subjected to a fair, albeit rigorous, examination. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their guilt undeniable. They were condemned, not for witchcraft, but for treason, for cruelty, and for the systemic abuse of power that had plunged Eldoria into a dark age of terror. King Thuron, humbled and irrevocably changed by the experience, spent the rest of his reign trying to atone for his past mistakes. He abolished the barbaric laws, initiated reforms to the legal system, and established new courts where justice was administered with fairness and compassion. He sought out the families of those who had been wrongly accused and executed, offering reparations and sincere apologies, though he knew some wounds could never truly heal. He also established a fund for the care of the orphaned children left behind by the witch trials. The lasting impact of the Salem witch trials, as these dark years came to be known in Eldoria, was profound. It left an indelible scar on the collective memory of the kingdom. Generations later, the stories of the innocent condemned, the cruelty of the trials, and the devastating consequences of unchecked power were passed down from parent to child. The legacy was a stark reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, of blindly following charismatic but malevolent figures, and of the ease with which fear and suspicion could dismantle the very foundations of justice and human decency. The people of Eldoria learned a harsh but vital lesson. They became fiercely protective of their rights, wary of any leader who sought to consolidate power through fear, and vigilant against the insidious spread of misinformation and prejudice. The legal reforms implemented by King Thuron became the bedrock of Eldorian law, emphasizing due process, the presumption of innocence, and the importance of verifiable evidence. Monuments were erected in honor of the innocent victims, silent tributes to those who had suffered, and a solemn promise that such an era of injustice would never again be allowed to consume the land. Queen Alara, who had quietly endured and then bravely spoken out, became a symbol of resilience and moral courage. Her wisdom and compassion were sought by many, and her influence helped shape a new era of enlightenment in Eldoria. Finn, the young peasant boy who had dared to uncover the truth, grew to become a respected scholar and advisor, his experience a constant reminder of the power of a single individual to stand against injustice. The downfall of King Thuron's arrogant rule was not his death, but the painful realization of his folly and his subsequent arduous journey toward redemption. The moral of this tale, whispered through the ages, was clear. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and unchecked authority, fueled by fear and manipulated by deceit, can lead a kingdom to the brink of ruin. Justice, once abandoned, is a heavy burden to reclaim, and the echoes of past cruelties can resonate for centuries, serving as a perpetual warning to future generations. The land of Eldoria, forever marked by the Salem witch trials, learned that true strength lies not in the iron fist of tyranny, but in the unwavering pursuit of truth, empathy, and the unwavering defense of every individual's inherent dignity. And so, the wind continued to whisper through the ancient forests, carrying with it the silent, powerful lessons of a dark chapter, lessons that reminded all who listened to remain ever watchful, ever questioning, and ever devoted to the light of justice. The air in Eldoria, once thick with the suffocating dread of Malakar's tyranny, slowly began to clear, much like the morning mist giving way to the sun. But the scars, they ran deep, etched not only into the weathered stones of the execution grounds, but into the very souls of the people who had endured such a prolonged nightmare. King Thuron, stripped of his former arrogance, walked with a stoop, the weight of his past follies pressing heavily on his shoulders. He would often spend hours in quiet contemplation, gazing at the empty throne where Malakar had once sat, a chilling reminder of how easily power could be twisted and how readily he had allowed himself to be manipulated. His efforts at atonement were tireless, almost relentless. He understood that simply punishing Malakar and his cronies was not enough. The kingdom needed to heal, to rebuild its trust in justice, and to ensure that such darkness never again clouded its lands. He commissioned scholars and legal minds to meticulously review every single case from the time of the witch trials. It was a painstaking process, filled with heartbreaking discoveries of fabricated evidence, forced confessions, and innocent lives cruelly extinguished. For each victim, King Thuron ordered a public decree of innocence, read aloud in the very villages where the accused had lived, a symbolic cleansing of their names. For the orphaned children, a special sanctuary was established, funded by the confiscated wealth of Malachar and his accomplices. It was a place where they could find safety, education, and the care that their lost parents could no longer provide. Queen Alara, with her innate kindness and gentle spirit, often visited the sanctuary, offering comfort and hope to the traumatized children, her presence a soothing balm in their young, fractured lives. She initiated programs to help these children reconnect with their surviving relatives, fostering a sense of community and healing that had been utterly shattered. The legal system underwent a radical overhaul. The absurd trials by ordeal were outlawed entirely, replaced by a system that demanded tangible proof, credible witnesses, and the right to legal representation, even for the humblest peasant. New judges were appointed, chosen not for their loyalty to the crown, but for their wisdom, integrity, and deep understanding of the law. These judges were tasked with upholding a new code of justice, one that prioritized fairness and the protection of individual rights above all else. This was a revolutionary concept in a kingdom where royal decree had often been the only law. Yet despite these earnest reforms, the shadow of the Salem witch trials lingered. Farmers, still haunted by the memory of neighbors turning on neighbors, found it difficult to fully trust one another. Whispers of suspicion, though no longer leading to arrests, occasionally resurfaced, reminding everyone of the fragility of peace and the enduring power of fear. Merchants struggled to revive trade. As the once vibrant marketplaces remained quieter, the joyful chatter replaced by a more subdued hum. The kingdom was learning, slowly, painfully, how to breathe again. The legacy of that dark period wasn't just a cautionary tale. It became a cornerstone of Eldorian identity. Storytellers, once forbidden from speaking of the trials, now wove intricate narratives of heroism and tragedy, ensuring that the sacrifices of the innocent were never forgotten. Ballads were sung in taverns, recounting the bravery of Brother Marcus and the quiet courage of Finn, inspiring a new generation to value truth and justice above all else. These tales were imbued with a moral clarity, emphasizing the dangers of prejudice and the critical importance of questioning authority, even royal authority, when it veered toward injustice. King Thuron, in his twilight years, established a royal council dedicated to human rights, an unprecedented move for a medieval monarch. This council, composed of respected scholars, former victims' relatives, and newly appointed, independent judges, was given the authority to review any allegations of injustice and to advise the crown directly. It was a mechanism designed to prevent any future ruler from wielding unchecked power, a living testament to Thuron's profound regret and his dedication to ensuring a just future for Eldoria. He had, in his downfall and subsequent redemption, carved out a legacy far more meaningful than any tyrannical reign could have achieved. Finn, the young peasant who had initiated the unmasking of Malachar, rose through the ranks, not through noble birth, but through his sharp intellect and unwavering moral compass. He became a key advisor to the royal council, his insights invaluable in shaping the new laws and ensuring their equitable enforcement. He never forgot the terror of his grandmother's fate, and this memory fueled his dedication to protecting the vulnerable. His journey from a terrified boy to a respected figure, underscored the lesson that even the smallest voice could ignite monumental change. The kingdom of Eldoria, though forever scarred, emerged from its crucible of fire and fear a stronger, more resilient society. The trials, punishments, and the painful legacy of that era had forced a collective introspection, a deep examination of their values and their responsibilities to one another. It was a stark reminder that true power resided not in the ability to instill fear and control, but in the capacity for empathy, the unwavering pursuit of truth, and the courage to right monumental wrongs. The chilling whispers of the condemned, those who had suffered unjustly, eventually faded from the immediate consciousness of the living, but their memory was preserved in the scrolls of history, in the stone monuments, and in the hearts of a people who learned that eternal vigilance was the true price of liberty. The story of Eldoria became a beacon, a somber warning to other kingdoms across the vast medieval world, cautioning against the seductive allure of absolute power and the destructive potential of fear-mongering. It taught them that true strength lay in the embrace of justice, in the protection of the innocent, and in the steadfast commitment to compassion, even in the darkest of times. The trees of the ancient forest still whispered, but now, instead of secrets of dread, they seemed to carry tales of resilience, of lessons learned, and of a hope for a more just future. The castles, once symbols of an arrogant king's unquestioned authority, now stood as bastions of reformed law, their walls echoing with the solemn promise of fairness. And as the generations passed, the story of the Salem witch trials of Eldoria served as an enduring moral, a timeless reminder that humanity's greatest strength lies not in its ability to inflict pain, but in its capacity for profound self-correction and its unending quest for a world built on justice and truth. It was a legacy of pain, yes, but also a legacy of powerful, transformative change. The quiet hum of the kingdom continued, a gentle rhythm of rebuilding and reflection that permeated every aspect of Eldorian life. Children born decades after the witch trials would still hear stories of the dark times, not as nightmares to terrify them, but as parables to guide them. These tales were woven into their schooling, recounted by their elders around crackling fires, and dramatized by traveling players in village squares. The moral fabric of Eldoria had been restitched with threads of remembrance and caution, ensuring that the collective trauma served a purpose beyond mere suffering. One of the most profound changes was the establishment of the Council of Witnesses. This unique body, proposed by Finn in his later years, comprised individuals from various walks of life, scholars, former victims' descendants, and even reformed former administrators of the old legal system. Their mandate was to actively investigate any burgeoning rumors of injustice, any whispers of prejudice, or any signs of an individual or group attempting to gain undue power through fear. They were essentially the kingdom's conscience, ever vigilant, ever questioning, and empowered to bring their findings directly to the royal council and, if necessary, to the king himself. This provided an essential check and balance, an early warning system against the subtle creeping return of tyranny. Queen Elara, who lived a long and respected life, became a living embodiment of the kingdom's healing. Her early attempts to soften King Thuron's hardened heart, though initially unsuccessful, had laid the groundwork for his eventual transformation. Her quiet resilience in the face of his arrogance and her unwavering compassion for the suffering people cemented her place in Eldorian history as Elara the Benevolent. She fostered cultural exchanges with neighboring kingdoms, emphasizing shared values of justice and human dignity, spreading Eldoria's hard-won lessons far beyond its borders. Her diplomatic efforts helped restore Eldoria's standing among other nations, which had been tarnished by the brutality of the witch trials. The economic recovery was slow, yet steady. The initial exodus of skilled artisans and knowledgeable farmers had left gaping holes in the kingdom's productivity. King Thuron, advised by a new generation of forward-thinking merchants and economists, implemented policies that encouraged innovation and craftsmanship. He understood that a truly prosperous kingdom was one where all its citizens felt safe and valued, where creativity could flourish without fear of being misconstrued as witchcraft. Guilds, once weakened by suspicion, were revitalized, becoming pillars of community and centers of excellence. They established fair prices, ensured quality goods, and protected the rights of their members, a far cry from the fearful, isolated individuals of Malakar's era. The forests of Eldoria, once feared as places where dark pacts were made, gradually reclaimed their ancient mystique, becoming places of reverence and peace. Herbalists like Old Ilara slowly regained their respected place in society, their knowledge no longer a source of suspicion, but a valuable asset for healing and well-being. Their practices were now openly studied and documented, stripping away the mystery that Malakar had exploited. This transparency was crucial in dismantling the foundations of superstition that had allowed the witch trials to take root. The architectural landscape of Eldoria also subtly shifted. While the grand castles remained, symbols of continuity, new structures emerged, public libraries filled with books on law, philosophy, and science, community halls where citizens could freely gather and discuss matters of governance, and notably, a grand hall of remembrance, where the names of all the innocent victims were etched in marble, accompanied by a flowing fountain, its waters symbolizing the tears shed and the cleansing of past injustices. This hall became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a space for reflection and a tangible reminder of the kingdom's painful evolution. The most enduring moral, however, was woven into the hearts of the Eldorian people, the absolute necessity of critical thought and the grave danger of mob mentality. They learned to question, to seek evidence, and to resist the easy answers provided by fear and prejudice. The phrase "remember Eldoria" became a common saying, whispered among friends, used as a proverb by elders, and invoked by leaders to underscore the importance of upholding justice and protecting the vulnerable. It was a constant, gentle reminder of their collective past and a powerful guide for their collective future. The reign of King Thuron, beginning in arrogance and fear, ended in humility and wisdom. He had been given a second chance, a rare gift for any monarch to rectify his gravest mistakes. His legacy was not defined by the initial cruelty he allowed, but by the profound and lasting reforms he enacted, the healing he fostered, and the unwavering commitment to justice he instilled in his kingdom. When he finally passed, his funeral was not a somber affair overshadowed by past misdeeds, but a testament to a king who had stumbled, suffered, and ultimately redeemed himself and his people. The Salem witch trials of Eldoria, though a period of immense suffering, ultimately forged a society more resilient, more compassionate, and more acutely aware of the delicate balance between power and responsibility. It was a story not just of despair, but of the human spirit's capacity for introspection, for change, and for the tireless pursuit of a more just world. And as the moon rose over the tranquil forests and the stars glittered above the now peaceful castles, One could almost hear the gentle whispers of the past, not of accusation, but of lessons learned, echoing through the ages.